Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to another episode, or I guess YouTube episode of the London Lyceum. We're an institution that's dedicated to serious thinking for a serious church. And in devotion of such an ideal, we've tried to endeavor to create an intellectual culture of charity, curiosity, critical thinking, and cheerful confessionalism. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, and I'm president of the London Lyceum, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this live Theological Education Q&A. As a note, when we're live, you'll have technical difficulties from here and there, so bear with us as we figure that out. I know we've got one of our guests who's working on getting their camera fixed, so hopefully we'll get that resolved momentarily. But as we've grown as an institution, we fielded more and more questions related to academics. And should I do a PhD? Where should I do one? Should I do an MA or an MDiv? Should I go an American or a UK program? And more. So we thought it would benefit everyone to put together an event with various thinkers ranging from, senior scholars to junior scholars to current students to pastors to help to discuss some of these questions. We think that will help answer some of those things that are out there. And it'll be a resource in years to come. So this will be just available on YouTube, so you can come check it out whenever you want and to think through some of the questions that might be able to help serve you in the future. Since this is a live recording, you can chat your questions as they come. We'll all see them. I'll highlight them at the appropriate times. Before we get started, don't forget to go ahead and hit the little click to subscribe and to like the video or whatever. I'm not a YouTube, expert quite yet, but here I've got enough skill to have a little banner to tell you to like and subscribe to the show. Now, without further ado, I do want to introduce all of our guests here. So we have with us several guests. We have Dr. James Eglinton, who it's in the afternoon, I believe, for over there in the UK. Well, you probably hear me brewing my coffee over here because it's very early in the morning for me. And we've got Ryan with us. We have Harrison. Ryan's in Kentucky. Harrison's in Michigan. And then we also have Dr. Brendan Case with us. And I think Parker Sedekay should be joining me as far as I know. So I haven't gotten any messages yet from him, the legendary Parker. But until then, we'll go ahead and continue on. And I've got a special cool little thing before we officially start, I think, here. Let's see, we can even put the cool little overlay here of the London Lyceum. I feel like I'm very technical and special. Now, we've got a particular set of questions that we hope to go through here. I don't know how many of them we'll get through, or if the comments and the chats that you guys send in, what kind of questions that you'll have. But as you chat them, I'll share them. So maybe we go ahead and start with a simple question of, and I could show this so people are watching. What is the context in which you serve, and more pertinently, the context in which you're usually having to answer these questions about doctoral work. So think of this as sort of the opportunity for each of you to give a little bit of a background on who you are and your own context. We can start. Who wants to start? We'll start with, Harrison, pastor of Oakland Hills Community Church.
Great. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm glad to get to do this. I think it's going to be fun. So, Jordan, thanks for inviting me. I feel a little bit out of my league, to be honest, with some of these guys. But every franchise needs a Jar Jar Binks, right? So here I am. So I'm Harrison Perkins. My sort of anchor calling is I'm the pastor at Oakland Hills Community Church, which is a congregation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We're just outside of Detroit. Detroit is sort of a weird major city in the sense that the downtown population is only about 500,000, but the greater Detroit area is 3.5 million. So nobody really lives in the city. And so we are, despite being sort of in the suburbs, trying to get where people are. I've just gotten here this year, but it's been great and still settling in, but loving it so far. For our wider discussion, I guess I also serve as online faculty for Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia in their church history program. And I also do a little bit of lecturing via Zoom, as might be obvious, especially these days, for Edinburgh Seminary in their systematics department. In terms of answering what's the context in which I usually have to answer questions about doctoral work? I do tend to get questions about where to go to seminary. That's a slightly different one, but I think that I might be the odd one out potentially on the issue of PhD studies or doctoral work, given my context as a pastor. Usually the questions I'm getting are from guys, a lot of times who haven't even gone to seminary yet. And so that the academic track is not necessarily in place and people thinking about the next step. It's guys saying, I want to go to seminary so that I can do a PhD. And I think that actually raises a couple of complications. So I fear that I'm going to be the pessimist here today, but I trust you'll sympathize with a slightly different context. I think one of the things I run into a lot is guys thinking, well, I think I'm better gifted academically than for the pastorate. So where can I go do a PhD and be the next big hitting theologian? And I sort of think that in that mindset, people need to be a bit more humble and be asking about the external call rather than presuming, because those questions are usually followed by, how can I do a study just in the English language? I want to be the next patristics historian, but I don't want to do anything with Latin. How can I do it for free? And what can make me a superstar? And it's sort of like, well, there's a few other things we need to get in place before we. So be patient with me. If I'm the honorary one here, you'll understand why I tend to have to push back a little more. And even guys who have done a master's degree, a lot of them are pastors, but and that's great. We'll get to should pastors do PhDs and why it's useful, but a lot of it's still grounded in the same thing. I don't want to have to learn another language. I really want this to be easy. Can you hand me the project? That sort of thing. And to some degree understandable, but that's sort of the context in which I have to answer this question a lot.
Good. That's helpful, Harrison. And I don't think you're the only curmudgeon, so we can be a happy group of curmudgeons here together.
I am one of the Presbyterians here, right? I mean...
Yeah, that's right. So, James, is it a Presbyterian technically denomination that you're in?
Yeah, technically and actually, okay. And happily, I'm Presbyterian all the way. So I teach at the School of Divinity, which is called New College at the University of Edinburgh. Theology has been taught here since the 16th century, so it goes way, way back in Edinburgh. The university is a big secular research university that has a historic divinity school, and so I teach across a whole spectrum of courses from first and second year undergraduates all the way up to masters and supervising doctoral students as well. So I've been there for the last 9 years. And before that, I was on the faculty in Kampen in the Netherlands for 3 years. Before that, I did a PhD at Edinburgh, and I worked as an assistant minister part-time in a church right in the middle of Edinburgh while I was doing my PhD, which I can come back to later on when we're talking about work-life balance when you're doing your doctorate. So that's the context that I serve in. And the kind of questions that I tend to get about doctoral work they're very often questions about doctoral work with me from prospective students. So I have a lot of that kind of conversation with people who are interested in coming to the UK. But I also talk a lot with people who are interested in doctoral work, but who don't want to work with me just because they have quite different specialisms or their life plans are just going a bit in a slightly different direction. But I'm in pretty regular contact with people who just want to explore the UK system as well, because it's quite different to the American doctoral system. And so I see myself as a point of contact in trying to help people make their very first attempt to navigate quite a different way to think about what a PhD looks like.
Helpful. And Brendan, it looks like you've been able to transfer to a very nice bougie location. So I'll let you go next. You're the Associate Director for Research at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. And so I'm excited to have you join us. But give us a little bit of background about what you're doing and the context in which you get these sort of questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. It's a pleasure to be here. Coming to you as of 5 seconds ago from Aspen. So it's lovely. But as you mentioned, I serve in a somewhat unusual context, I think, for an academic theologian, because I work primarily in a research and sort of administrative role at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University, which is a kind of self-contained research institute within the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And so I work with a couple of other theologians at the moment, but also with psychologists and sociologists and people from across the social sciences. And I am also an occasional lecturer in the divinity school at Harvard. So I do teach some theology, but it's not a kind of core part of my role there. I will say, I mean, given I don't have this conversation as often as those of you who are teaching, more consistently, I would guess, in a seminary or undergraduate setting do. But invariably, whenever I teach master students, especially, I get questions from people who have sort of caught the bug academically and are interested in pursuing that life as a vocation and potentially as a profession. And the questions are usually some version of, this sounds really fun, but will I ruin my life if I attempt it? So yeah, I mean, I guess we'll get to the bad news later, but I'm also quite dour, not to be outdone, Harrison. Yeah, in my pessimism.
Awesome. And then we also have Ryan with us, who he's got a more cool formal title than PhD student, but we'll put that in there now. Ryan, give me a little bit of your own context.
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm working on systematic theology, so I have a number of projects going on. I have some translation works in the mix with 17th century Reformed scholastic authors. The PhD project is basically trying to put forward a constructive account of participation in God and adoption by putting into conversation contemporary accounts of participation in Paul in biblical studies, and then putting that in conversation with medieval and scholastic accounts of participation, regeneration, adoption, and all the rest. So I am by far the youngest person in like the academic journey on this. I don't know what we call this. It's not really a podcast, but this product.
It's a panel of some sort.
Yeah. And this is also the first interview I've ever done. So I am way out of my depth. So Harrison said that he was the Jar Jar Binks of this program. I don't know if that makes me, but I'm much further down. I'm like trying to learn how to be a Jar Jar Binks. But yeah, I don't get this question very often from people. When I was starting my MDiv, I had questions from college students who were interested in possibly going to seminary, but that's been a number of years. And now that I'm in the PhD program, typically here at Southern at least, most master students, if they do well, feel like they need to do a PhD. And I'm often the person who's saying, well, you probably don't need to do a PhD. And I'm like, as with the others, I'm often dissuading people from pursuing higher education. And if they still feel inclined to do more, I'm often the person trying to encourage them to do a THM or some other project than a PhD, just because the PhD is such a bear. It's such a long degree program. It requires so much from people. And it's often not what people need. Just if they're wanting, like, if they have an itch to do more academic work and they feel like the PhD is the right fit, it's like, well, maybe, but that's something you should be in the process of discerning with lots of mentors in your church over a long period of time. And maybe it is, but maybe it's not. But yeah, I'm still figuring things out as I go. I'm in the middle of this process. I'm finishing with coursework basically right now as we speak. And then I have comprehensive exams and my prospectus due in the spring. So I'm right in the thick of things.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. And then for those of you who aren't familiar with my own journey, I'll give a little bit of context. So I'm finishing up my PhD at the University of Birmingham in the UK, though I live in North Carolina. So that makes me a little bit unique compared to some of these guys. I think I'm probably the only person who's done a non-residential PhD program. And I have an MDiv and THM from seminaries. I am a research fellow at the Center for Faith and Culture at Southeastern Seminary. So I have a little bit of context there, but I also run the London Lyceum, which is a broader sort of academic work that's interacting with a lot of different people. So I feel like from that, I get quite a few questions about PhD sort of stuff. Oftentimes people assume mistakenly that I have a PhD, so they just start asking me stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, I can try to guide you a little bit as much as I can. I'm somewhere between very pessimistic about people doing PhDs and also very optimistic, because I'm like, I'm passionate about education and learning, and I think everybody should be well equipped. And as long as you have the right mindset about further education, I'm like, just go do it. Like, as long as you don't think that there's some pot of gold at the other end of the rainbow that you're automatically going to get this, super awesome job where you're the coolest person that's ever been there, and all you do is just tour the country and go speak or whatever. Like, as long as you have the right mindset, I'm pretty like, yes, I think you should do it, because it's going to enrich you in a lot of ways. It's going to teach you a lot of skills that you would not have the opportunity to get otherwise. So I'm somewhere between like very pessimistic of like, no, you don't need one, but also it would be good for you to develop a lot of those skills for whatever you're doing. I mean, I work full time in the finance industry. The skills that I'm obtaining here are surprisingly very cross-functional to being a business intelligence manager in a regular, normal day-to-day job. So I feel like we've got a good mix of people here, a lot of different levels of their career. So Ryan and me are still in the process of finishing. Ryan's at a seminary. I'm at a normal university. James is in the UK. Brendan and Harrison are both in the US, but Harrison's a pastor. Brendan's at sort of like an academic sort of post, sort of not, like not like a teaching post. So really nice mix of guys here. So I'm excited about being able to talk about this. So if I can't remember if I reminded you all, we had some more people who are going to join, but unfortunately they're not able to. And I don't know where Parker is, so I'll roast him right now and just say, Parker has no excuse. If you don't know Parker Spence's, you can go find it on YouTube. He's one of the premier philosophy sort of YouTube experiences out there. So I think he likes to think of himself as like the Joe Rogan of philosophy. So if you're into those sort of things, go check it out. I will note I have a 4-year-old and 2-year-old in the house, so they very well could randomly show up. So if you see them, just say hi. First question. Let's go ahead and go with this. How do you know if you should pursue PhD studies? And you can insert any other advanced degree if you want to. I don't know who wants to jump in on this. If somebody has some extreme, strong feelings toward this question. I know, Harrison, you mentioned discussing sort of a calling. If you want to cash that out a little bit, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I'll start. I think some limiting factors to get going is, because again, I mean, so the students with whom James interacts are very different from the people that are asking me this question, and so we're going to have different answers. And I don't think that they're in conflict. I think it's partly a contextual issue. One thing is, you probably shouldn't think that I need to do a PhD just because you've read more books than other people at your church. There's a lot of guys who come and say, well, in my church, like, I think I'm more into this than other people. It's like, well, that could be. And that's a good reason to go to seminary. If you're gifted in studying and teaching the material back to people. But take it one step at a time, because you may be the big fish in one pond and get to the next pond and not be quite as big in comparison. And so just feel it out as you go. I also would say another limiting factor is, don't think it's self-appointed, in the sense of if other people aren't endorsing you as sort of a candidate for this kind of thing, well, then probably you should be hesitant about it. Coming from the trajectory of church to seminary to thinking about PhD track, and so yeah, I was mentioning the external call. I don't think that anybody coming on this podcast will sort of disagree with the idea of the internal external call to ministry, and I think that we have that applied to, I mean, we have vocations in life, right? It's not just our paid work, it's not just a vocation of ministry. All of the things that God gives us to do are our vocations and good, and part of that is, it means we're called to it, which means it comes from outside of us. And if you're fighting really hard to find the place where you can do a PhD and where you fit, and it just doesn't seem to work, and you don't have the ideas, well, you should probably rethink it. Another limiting factor is to draw on that sense of, so I guess the external call thing is listen to people. We're Christians. We live in community. Get counsel and wise counsel. I think that's to sum that up. But then to draw on the aspect of an idea, if you're kind of in the place of where I have no ideas about what I want to study, or I just want a PhD, and want to teach something somewhere, maybe wait and crystallize some of these things. That's not to say no. It's just to think, I should probably refine my thoughts and how much I know about the disciplines and what I want to do with it more positively. I remember when I was first thinking about these issues, and I talked to Chad Van Dixhorn, who's at Westminster, Philadelphia now, and I just say, every time I talk to Chad, I come away more sanctified, and so he's a real blessing and a thoughtful pastoral but high level academic. And Chad asked me when I said, well, some people said I should ask you about this, and he said, why do you want a PhD? And I said, well, actually the main thing is I want to be better equipped to serve the church. I enjoy writing. I think that I could potentially, have an output in print and maybe teach, who knows? I don't really know if that's where I want to end up, but I want to be equipped to do other things. And my professors seem to think that I make the grades to go ahead and do it. And he said, okay, good. I wouldn't give you advice if you had said something different. So the guys who come out thinking, I want to be the next systematic theologian or the next, top level church historian. Well, you could be. I don't want to dissuade you, but if your mom's the only one who told you that, then, well, chill out. And the reality is there are very few academic jobs. And if you think I'm going to do this because I will be the guy who gets an academic job, I think you need to be very hesitant. If you have the time, resources, capacity, gifts to do it, and want to do a doctoral work in order to be equipped to do various things and be refined in your skills for them, wonderful. I'm happy to have that conversation. These other guys will encourage you too. But if that's not the rationale, you should be more skeptical, and I'm skeptical when you come to me.
Good. Any other comments or thoughts? Any disagreements or adjustments or your own personal context that you want to share?
Yeah, I can say something, I guess. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what Harrison just said, and a lot of it that chimes with my own experience as well. I think that with the way that the academy works now, it's probably quite rare to find a PhD program that you can just step into without something between your like first theology degree, whether that's your MDiv or something like that, and then the PhD. So you have a THM or something like that in the middle. And I think that's a really important testing ground in when for starting to think about the kind of gifts you have and how you're applying them and how you might use those gifts best in the longer term. So I think if you're in that intermediary space, let's say in a THM program or some kind of master's level work that includes some significant research driven work as well. So you're actually, you're not just a student sitting in classes and writing about in short word counts about the things that your professors tell you to write about. You're actually taking your first steps on the path to contributing something new to knowledge. And I think if you're in that kind of space in your development and you are really excelling and standing out at that level, and also if other people that you trust are suggesting to you, maybe you should think about doing a PhD, and they can see potential in you, and they can see that you have scope, so that your master's work isn't the end of the road, and that's not as far as you can peak, but they can see in you that there's potential that you could carry on beyond that. I think if you're in that position, then you should be giving some serious thought to whether a PhD could be the right thing for you to do. I think if you have the grades and if you have the opportunity to do it, but I think beyond that as well, if you have a realistic sense of what you want to use the PhD for afterwards, for me, that's crucial. So in our program, when people apply, they have to submit a research proposal that details the project. So we're looking to see that, for them, it's not just that they want the title or the letters before or after their name. What they want is to advance our knowledge of something that's really important and that needs to be advanced. So it's a project that then is rewarded with or recognized with the degree afterwards. So they have to have a research proposal, but they also have to submit a personal statement. And that's where we look to see how does this person have the emotional maturity to handle a really difficult and long degree? And do they have some kind of realistic sense of what they want to use this for afterwards? And a really weak personal statement will be weak because it's so unrealistic. It's, I want to do this PhD so that I can, wear a tweed jacket with elbow patches and smoke a pipe and live the life of a scholar and read my favorite books at Cambridge University specifically, and that's my future. That's probably not going to happen. And the reality is that if you do end up in an academic job somewhere, there's just so much of your job that isn't at all really to do with your scholarship. It's filling in forms. It's living in this vast bureaucratic system, and it's really a fight in the long term to claw out enough time just to do some research rather than have that as the theme of the rest of your life. So what we look for in the personal statement there is that the person who's applying has some kind of sense of what this is for, that will make a difference in the rest of their lives and to the wider world. And we can see that it's not completely, ridiculously unachievable, that there's something there that makes us think this person could make a difference for for the good in the world with this degree.
Yeah, that's helpful, James. And we can come back to this more if we want, but I do want to move to a next question. And for those of you who are watching, yes, my children are throwing their play food down the stairs, and therefore I am going to help clean that up. Let's see here. So the next question and I guess I do want to add one comment on that first question. How do I know? I've heard oftentimes a lot of people say, well, can you imagine yourself doing anything else? And if you say yes, then okay, go do that. And I've always found that kind of ironic and funny advice. So whether it's true or not, it is an interesting question to ask. Now, this question,
and also,
go ahead, Harry.
Even if you can imagine doing something else, you may not get to do it.
That's right. Okay, so this question probably might take a little bit of time because I see this one quite a bit. What's the difference between a PhD and a DMin? What about THM or MA versus MDiv? I think this is a pretty important and relevant question, so we can spend some time here working through that. I know I have an MDiv, a THM, finishing a PhD. I think, Ryan, you have MDiv, THM, working on your PhD. And I know, Brendan, you have a THD, so you also have a unique experience. So I don't know who wants to start in on this and maybe cash out some of the differences, explain it. And I know, James, I think you probably have like MLITs and all sorts of different things. So even you have some different context.
So I have a law degree and then a BTH, which was an MDiv equivalent in a Scottish context, and then a PhD. But I think I was part of the very last generation to get to go straight from a Bachelor in Theology degree into the PhD without doing an MTH in between. So I think now that's impossible. But I'd done 2 undergrad degrees and I'd written 2 dissertations. So because of that, they thought that I would be able to handle going straight into the PhD.
So that's probably, if we could build some aspects of this, one of the differences between America and the British context is our seminaries are master's degrees by and large, whereas seminaries in Britain or in the UK, sorry to slate that as Britain, James, are often bachelor's degrees. And so there is a needed gap filler between a bachelor's and a PhD that is a master's in the British context. And I mean, I think that they did used to be stronger, even not that long ago. But I mean, there is a push in the UK seminaries that are bachelor's levels that this needs to be bachelor's levels and not sneaking in master's level requirements. When you come to America, the American context of seminaries, well, they are masters, but then you have to ask the question of, well, what sort of masters, and what is the seminary curriculum? My MDiv is essentially the MA in theological studies and the MA in biblical studies plus preaching courses. So in the breakdown of classes, I actually have a composite of 2 MAs plus extra stuff. Other seminaries don't have their MDiv sort of as academically weighted, and so that's not a that's a pragmatic thing, not a look at this seminary thing. It's because PhD courses are going to look at your transcripts and ask what courses have you had to determine whether you need other master's work to fill in the gap. If you're even with an MDiv, if it's a more academic course, lots of theology, lots of history, lots of bib studies, then it may do the trick. And mine did. Other seminaries may be less weighted in the academic direction, and those are just considerations to keep in mind about building towards doctoral work as you are in a master's program.
I guess I'll jump in here. Yeah, so my academic pathway, I think, was somewhat eccentric compared to others in the group, in the sense that I did all of my graduate work at Duke Divinity School, which is in a university setting at Duke University, and so I did the MTS there, which is a 2-year kind of academic launchpad, I think, effectively is how they think of it, and then went right into the Doctor of Theology program, which I think the THD designation. I mean, this might not be this, at least in an American setting. I know for a number of years there were research-oriented doctoral programs housed at divinity schools. Typically, were called THDs. So Harvard, I think, is now phasing it out, but had one for a long time. And so there is a PhD program at Duke as well, obviously, which is run through the graduate program in religion. And there's also, I'll say, there's also at Duke a DMin program, which I never taught for, but helped with in various ways during my time as a doctoral student. And I mean, maybe I'll speak a little bit to the difference between those two. I mean, broadly speaking, the DMin differs from terminal research doctorates, so PhD or THD, in that it primarily caters to working pastors, typically pastors who've been in ministry for a while, and who are interested. I mean, to be frank, I think very often what they're primarily interested in having a PhD, so being able to describe themselves as doctor. I hope that's not too cynical. I mean, because they're also clearly interested, since they commit to this years-long process, clearly interested in doing some kind of sustained research. Although even then, typically the research program that you undertake in a DMin has a much more practical orientation than the kind of projects that would be undertaken for a dissertation in a PhD or THD setting. So, I mean, often to the point of involving field work, say. Having a kind of focus on quite immediate application, to the life of the church, which is great. So, and the other big difference, I guess, which I would flag as well, is that the DMin tends to be funded much less generously, if at all, than research PhDs or THDs. So typically they're self-funded.
Yeah, and I'll add a couple of comments. I mean, Brendan, I don't have a DMin. But I share the same cynicism, I think, towards that degree, that oftentimes what happens is people want to have doctor next to their name. And that's not the case across the board. So I don't want, if you're watching this and you have a DMin, that I don't want that to be the thing. But I do think there is a danger with that degree, that's what it does become, is I need to have doctor next to my name for whatever reason. Maybe it's your own context. They feel like you need to do that for some reason. And so that's the easiest sort of on-ramp. But I do think there are massive differences between that degree and a research-oriented PhD degree. So you've got to really discern, what is my goal? If your true goal is, I've been a pastor for 10 years and I just want some guided help in thinking through a pastoral question in my congregation. Maybe it's, we want to think through how do we handle divorce and remarriage, things like that. And I think, maybe a DMin is an appropriate sort of degree to apparatus to help you think through that, to have somebody sort of guide you and think about that. But I do think, at least in the seminary context that I've been encountered, DMins are not high quality degrees. And I don't want that to sound arrogant or anything. I just want that to be clear, that I think if you want to do education, you probably should consider something else. Personally, I'm a big fan of THM degree. I meet a lot of people who are sort of like in this like in between stage of, I feel like I need more education and to be prepared for whatever ministry context I'm going in. I don't think I have the sort of perseverance to do a PhD. So they feel like, well, what do I do? I'm like, I think the THM is an awesome degree personally. I think it's not massive. You can do a research-oriented THM where you do a research project, and you can, at least in the American seminary context, oftentimes you can take the PhD seminars for your THM. So you can really get a quality, very quality, high education from doing a degree like that. So I usually, especially for pastors who are looking for further education and further equipping, I think THM is really a better route in most cases. Yeah, you don't get doctor next to your name, but I think you're going to get a higher level of education and a higher quality degree, really, from that experience. And then the MA, MDiv, and of course, I think to Harrison's point, that may be somewhat just an effect of our own in America context, where the master's degree is really, the MDiv is almost like it really is a bachelor sort of level education. So people feel this gap of, I feel like I need to have some more serious education. I think THM is great. I know the MDiv is designed for pastors. And the MA, sometimes I'm a little bit more partial to the MA than the MDiv in some senses, because I think a lot of the courses that are required in the American MDivs are courses that should not be taught in the seminary context. They should be taught in a local church context. I think courses like leadership, evangelism, these other things should be what you're learning in your own local church. You should not be wasting your time in a seminary doing bachelor's level work on that. Now, that's not, I don't want to universalize that. That's not always the case. There are good stuff to learn from them, et cetera. But sometimes I'm like, maybe you should just do an MA and not lose out on your whole life, 10 years of your life doing an MDiv. But those are my own personal thoughts. I don't know if any of you guys disagree, Ryan or James, if you have any other comments.
I will tack on something. Oh, go ahead, James.
Yeah, no, you go first, Ryan. Go first.
Oh, I was just going to tack on something quickly, because I listened to Harrison and then James talk about, or reverse order, James and then Harrison talk about the differences in the European context and the American context. And at least I'll speak about Southern Baptist seminaries, because I'm not broadly familiar with all the seminaries in the U.S., but I've been at a Southern Baptist institution for the past number of years, and I'm pretty familiar with other sister Southern Baptist seminaries. And at least here, as Jordan said, the MDiv is like a second BA. And often there is a gap between doing an MDiv and being ready for PhD work. And that's where I'm just thoroughly convinced that most people who finish with an MDiv ought to consider doing a THM before applying to PhD programs, because they haven't typically done anything like a longer research program. They haven't vetted that out to see whether they're apt to do such things. They haven't done enough reading in a field to really have a kind of expertise to consider applying to do a PhD. So they don't have a research program. They have some general idea of what to talk about because they heard a professor in some class say something that they thought was provocative, and they're like, oh, I want to think about that more. And that's great. That often can be one way into a research program. Is you think about something and it's not substantiated in the literature, and you want to develop that some more. So it's good, but you need to do a lot of reading in primary source literature and secondary sources to be able to think through whether or not that's worthy of a whole dissertation. And the THM is a good degree to like take some of the courses that Jordan was talking about, maybe at a PhD level, and then start working toward a longer research project. And if that's fruitful, then that would be a really great like first draft for a proposal to a PhD program somewhere.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So the comment I was going to make is that I hear reasonably regularly, a few times every year, from pastors who say that they want to do a PhD. And I mean, some of the comments Harrison made earlier are quite recognizable as well, because when you raise the question of, okay, so this is what it will involve, are you willing to learn a couple of research languages that you don't currently know? Oh, no, I don't have time for that. Okay, well, then you can't do the PhD that you want to do because this is an essential skill. You won't be able to read the sources. So quite often pastors who are interested in, or they think that the PhD is what they want to do, but they just very often don't have a very clear picture of what the PhD actually entails. And very often I'll hear from pastors who want to do a PhD as a solution to it might be a very real challenge or problem or debates in the kind of theological circles or the church circles that they move in. So for the last 3 months, everyone's been talking about issue X. So I want to do a PhD that will be the proper theological last word on issue X. But I think that approach it's not a good understanding of what can be accomplished in a PhD, in that, especially if this is a pastor who wants to do a PhD part-time. So you're talking like minimum of 6 years. So in reality, in 6 months down the line, everyone will have forgotten about whatever the big raging debate is today, and there'll be some other big thing that everyone's very upset about and falling out about on Twitter or whatever. And it's 6 years down the line, you turn up with your solution, and it's really just historical, ancient history now in the Christian debate world. So a PhD is not a nimble piece of work like that. It's not reactive to like very short-term trends. And you can't use a PhD to solve those kinds of issues at all. But I think just a lot of pastors, again, have maybe been out of seminary for quite a long time, and they've been a bit detached from the wider research community, and they've misunderstood what the PhD is for. But I would say in defense of DMin programs, I don't have tons of personal experience of them. But they are a lot more nimble in that regard. And very often if a pastor wants to have the opportunity to think and to say something constructive about some kind of current issue and just have a bit of scope for that and get some academic credit for it, a DMin is a much better degree to look into than a PhD in that regard. A PhD is such a huge sacrifice of so much in your life in order to make a very specific contribution to a very niche area of knowledge. So you have to understand what you're getting yourself in for in the first place. But I think, I take Jordan's point as well, that a THM can be a really good way to do that as well. It's a lot more nimble. It's a 1 year thing. You're not going to run the risk of putting yourself, horrendously out of date by the time you get the thing finished.
James, did you actually suggest that being strongly opinionated about something happening on Twitter isn't a reason to do a PhD?
Yeah, a hot take. Yeah, indeed. That's my hot take for today.
Yeah. Jordan, can I make just one further comment about the question of the THM? I'm speaking, somewhat as an outsider, since I don't have one and didn't really consider doing one, to be honest. But I take your point. I mean, what everything that Ryan and James you've said about the reality that very often today someone who's finished an MDiv is just not ready to go on to do a doctoral program, particularly in the UK setting, maybe where they're just thrown into the dissertation. But to me, just looking on the trend towards adding a second master's on, in the pathway to doctoral work, seems incredibly dispiriting. I have to say, and it's hard not to feel as though it represents a real abdication of responsibility on the part of the institutions that are actually supposed to be training, theologians and church historians and biblical scholars, that they're sort of farming out the responsibility effectively for teaching them to very often some other institution, where someone goes to do the 1-year master's. But because the thing to consider, of course, is that these are not these degrees are not cheap, very often, and they're often much more self-funded than an MDiv or an MTS is, or an MA is. So anyway, yeah, I have lots of friends who have done or even have done a second MTS or MA, on the way, who have been very successful. But it feels a bit like a race to the bottom, I have to say, when I see candidates for doctoral programs sort of piling up. Oh gosh, sorry, this thing is like, my screen is freaking out. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll just go back to blurring it. But you know what I'm saying? That it feels as though the candidate pool is sort of in this strange sort of race to the bottom, piling up degrees to try to impress application committees in a situation in which the pool of jobs is actually shrinking quite rapidly. So anyway, this is something to consider. Near term, maybe the THM just is the least bad option, but it seems as though, James, as you pointed out, it didn't used to be this way, right? So if it didn't used to be this way, presumably we could find a way to revert back to an older, maybe better model.
So I agree with you, and that I think that's helpful. Just to try to draw a line to practical, concrete considerations in that regard. If you're going to go to seminary and do an MDiv, but have even hopes of doing a PhD, pick a seminary that will help you get there. Don't go to Tim's backyard seminary, three blocks down the road, and think, oh, well, I'll just make up the difference with a THM, or I'll definitely get straight into a PhD. Pick a seminary that has a curriculum that even in the MDiv will put you into a PhD program without having to make up the difference. Now, there are all sorts of other factors that can go in that you may need to shore up the gap with a THM or something like that. Institutionally or in your own ability, that sort of thing, all of those factors are still at play. But that is one consideration, is just think through all the steps.
Yeah. And I think Brendan, your point is very well taken. I think of the difference that when I was at Southern for my MDiv, they would always tell stories about A.T. Robinson, about his sort of like, I don't know if it was his first year sort of Greek course and the syllabus and the expectations he had for students. And I think every single student that was there at Southern, including myself, would fail whatever it is he was teaching at that time because of the level of intensity. So there is a massive difference in what used to be expected of students for those degree programs to what has happened today. And I don't know all the sociological factors of why that's happened, or of where we've potentially watered down a lot of our degrees, at least in the American context. But that does seem to be a real issue, and we shouldn't just gloss over it and say, well, all the problem is just the rest of us. Academic institutions are also responsible for some of these things. And it seems to me that this is more of a problem in an American context, particularly in evangelical contexts, than it is so much in other settings. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
If I can jump in with a pastoral point, just to be that guy who's the pastor on the panel, just to follow up with all of that, like, if you're in your MDiv or master's program and you're thinking about doing it, listen to Philippians 2 and do everything without grumbling or complaining. If you're saying my 10-page paper is too long, my professor grades, this little assignment too hard, then don't you dare talk about a PhD. Be grateful for a rigorous seminary education, because it's preparing you for how to feed God's people first and foremost. And you should dig a deep well just for that. But all the more, if you think you really ought to do a PhD, or that's the thing in store. Well, do every hard assignment joyfully and gladly, and don't think that it's too tough, because man, you got another thing coming.
Yeah, and when you're thinking about your MDiv program as well, not every MDiv program has something like a dissertation component. So if you're really interested in doing a PhD after the MDiv, it's really important that you choose an MDiv that does have something like that, or that the MDiv program that you're in gives you the scope to do some kind of independent study with a professor that meets that kind of requirement, and that also gives you a testing ground to work out. Can I do my own research? Can I write at length? And do I find any joy in this? And am I good at it?
Yeah, and I'll say one difference maybe in the typical MDiv setting and my master's experience is that I don't know if it's absolutely required, but it's strongly encouraged for MTS students at Duke to do a thesis, at the end of the term, which I did find to be quite helpful. Yeah, as just to have some long project to be able to send, to be able to send to prospective advisors.
And one other point as well is that, I mean, this is culturally very alien from a European perspective, but I have come across people in the US who are interested in doing a PhD, but who in principle chose to do a non-accredited degree for whatever reason, that they don't want to be part of an accreditation process. And it's a free country, I guess, so you could make that choice there, but a consequence of that is that it will be exceptionally difficult for you to get into an accredited PhD program afterwards. And that's the program that you've entered as part of a bigger ecosystem of programs, and there are some directions that you just can't move in if you choose an unaccredited degree. And you have to live with that consequence as well.
Yeah. And Eric, it looks like who's watching has a good question that I'll just pop in here. So what value, if any, do you see for a PhD in a purely pastoral context with no actual academic ambitions?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that, because when I started my PhD, it was with a view to becoming a pastor, and I didn't have any immediate academic ambitions at all. So I come from a pretty small Presbyterian denomination in Scotland. We have our own seminary, which is where Harrison does some teaching, and Scotland is a really small country, and my denomination is a tiny little church in a small country. And I did okay at seminary in terms of grades, and I enjoyed it. And people in the church around me thought that I could be useful in some kind of teaching capacity. So I thought when I finished my seminary training, that this was a good time to do a PhD. I was still fairly young and had the energy and the desire to do it, and I got a place at the university. But I would still I think I was 28 when I finished my PhD, so I knew that I would still be quite young finishing it. And my expectation was that I would go into pastoral ministry, and then eventually, when I was a good bit older, I would be available and qualified to teach at the seminary if they needed me there. So I chose my PhD for that reason. Part of it was that I thought it would be, coming from a confessionally reformed seminary background, where like the theologically diverse person in my year group was a really conservative Lutheran from Alaska, but the rest of us were all really conservative Scottish Presbyterians. And I thought it'd be really useful for me to spend 3 years in a divinity school like the one I went to, which was ideologically extremely diverse, but you're dealing with actual human beings who are really smart, thoughtful, articulate people who don't think at all like I do. I also knew that as part of the program, I would get the chance to teach undergraduates, and they are mostly not people who self-identify as Christians. So to have the chance to teach really great theological texts to very smart, mostly non-Christian 18-year-olds, that's great preparation for pastoral ministry, because you have to spend a lot of time in pastoral ministry explaining the Christian faith to people who don't believe it. And so I thought that the context could be really useful for pastoral ministry. But what I really wanted was to have some kind of a process of apprenticeship to a great theologian from the past. So I was just so hungry for that after my seminary training, where I felt like I loved everything that I was doing, but I felt like in each class I was just scratching the surface, and I really wanted something much more substantial that would be something to draw on, a well that I could continually draw water from for the rest of my life in ministry. And so I chose my topic fairly deliberately in that regard. I thought, okay, so a figure like Herman Bavinck, who I then worked on, theologically very relatable to my own tradition, but still interesting enough, different enough to be interesting. Historically, he wasn't around that long ago, so he's facing a lot of the same kind of issues that I face in Scotland in the 21st century, and choosing a really core doctrine for him. Like, how does the doctrine of the Trinity relate to his way of viewing the cosmos as a place to inhabit? That is all really edifying and fruitful stuff to think about anyway, and to get to think about it with such a great theologian and to try and trace out, how does he join the dots in his thinking? Because it's quite often surprising. So I viewed it as an apprenticeship that I thought would make me a better preacher, a better theologian in order to be a better preacher, a sharper theologian, more precise, more nuanced. And, I guess one of the big skills that you hopefully learn in a PhD is that it looks like it's the longest thing you will ever write, at least at that stage of life, 100,000 words. And that's a lot. But at the same time, when you start writing it, you realize that you're writing about a huge topic, and it's really difficult actually to cram it into 100,000 words. So you have to learn to become really precise and skilled, with a lot of brevity in how you write accurately about major things. And those skills for pastoral ministry, if you can really nail them down in the PhD, are just invaluable. And being able to, because every time you prepare to preach, you're dealing with scriptural texts that are so profound, and you're dealing with the human soul, which is so complex. And there's so much going on in the background, and the sermon, hopefully, is just the tip of the iceberg of everything that you're reflecting on and trying to bring together. And a PhD is kind of like that as well, the thesis itself. So I wanted the experience in order to pastor, and that's the path that I followed eventually became quite different, and I ended up, to my surprise, teaching in an academic environment longer term. But I still preach, and I found that the PhD made me a much better preacher. I hope, anyway.
I sort of took the same trajectory as James, but with the other side of the outcome. I'm in pastoral ministry, and don't really. I mean, to the guy's question, I don't really have ambitions to move on to an academic post. I'm very happy. I guess the one qualification is I do like writing, and I hope to keep writing. That's the academic ambition I have. But what value is it? Really, James's last point there, that seminary often teaches you, some seminaries are better, but a lot of seminaries teach you writing is just sort of getting things out. And that's how your preaching happens. A PhD teaches you to argue. There's a point in calling it a thesis. You've got one thing and you're trying to drive it home for 100,000 words. And that refines your thinking in terms of how you analyze what's going on in a pastoral conversation. You sort of synthesize. You get trained to synthesize very quickly and see into what's happening. There's some intuition that pastors just need to have for that, but this helps. But then also, when you're making a sermon, I consider myself probably a writer prior to being a preacher. I write a full manuscript and preach from it. And I hope I don't sound like I'm reading. I don't think I sound like I'm reading. But that's part of my process. And it's because it sharpens what I'm trying to say. And so there is that aspect. There are other ways to learn that skill besides a PhD, to the gentleman's question. THMs can help you in that regard, but a PhD will certainly do the trick.
So one thing I could add as well is that when I was a teenager, something that I noticed was, so I listened to some preachers who were totally outstanding and who didn't have PhDs. They were able to preach with great clarity, precision, insights in the biblical text and also in the human soul. But I also became quite aware that I knew a few pastors who did have PhDs, a small group of them, and just across the board, they all seem to have this particular skill of knowing how to formulate a really insightful question, where the question itself was instructive, regardless of the answer, and they knew how to I guess, analyze, again, really huge things, but convey them with so much accuracy and insight in the pulpit as well. And that was actually the first thing that for me as a teen made me think it would be really good to get a PhD, just because I want to do what these guys do when they preach. And I had no idea at that point what their dissertations were on, but there was something that they all seemed to have acquired through the training. So that was what actually first put it on my radar, and it was with a view to trying to become better as a preacher.
I gotta unmute myself. I do want to have some other questions in here. So I know, Scott, you asked a question. I'll get to you, Scott, in a second. There are a couple things that I think get asked quite a bit that I want to make sure that we touch on at least briefly. So this can be a really useful resource. So oftentimes we've touched on this a little bit. What's the difference between a PhD at a seminary and one at a university? I don't know if somebody wants to like directly tackle that. I mean, from my experience, it seems that it's not necessarily going to be a massive difference. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But a lot of that difference ends up being in sort of the pastoral context that you're experiencing. So for me at a university setting, my supervisor is not a Christian. So he doesn't mentor me like this is a discipleship relationship and I'm going to check on you spiritually, those sort of things. It is an academic degree where he's examining my arguments and making sure that I'm doing good scholarship. There's not a, check on your life, how's your family doing, those sort of things. Whereas in the seminary context, it seems to me there's much more of a pastoral heart, like, hey, I'm actually interested in your life. I want to make sure that you're not experiencing burnout, that you're still going to church, that you still are a Christian, that you still read the Bible, you're still praying and doing basic Christian things. And to me, that is the biggest usual difference. That's not always the case. You can have Christians at university contexts who can treat you with the same level of love and care. But it seems, I think, by and large, that for me, that would probably be one of the big differences. I don't know if anybody else has any comments.
I think just pragmatically off the top, and then a more principled thing. I have, as people think about this question, because seminary PhDs are, in one sense, easier to get into. Now, not necessarily if you're at Duke or Princeton, that kind of thing. Those are a different ballgame. But the evangelical seminaries, I have been told straight to my face that because most people watching this probably are thinking about teaching in a seminary, not just any academic post. And seminary faculty have said one of the ways that we filter applications is that we take all of the applications that are seminary PhDs and not universities and throw them in the garbage. So now, whether it should be or shouldn't be, that's a different question. I don't know, but it is an easy filtering technique that institutions use, which was something that weighed heavily on me in my decision. Now, there are exceptions. Calvin Seminary, when Richard Muller was there, produced some really high-level stuff. Todd Rester is at Westminster, Philadelphia now, and is an outstanding scholar, went through that program with Muller. Matthew Barrett seems to be cranking out high-level PhD guys at Midwestern Baptist. Steve Wellham is a really sharp guy at Southern. And I think, Ryan, you said you're studying with Steve. And from a personal perspective, if I hear Steve was supervising you, I think, that's probably going to be a good project. Whether institutions recognize that is a different question. And Matthew Barrett did. He's the guy driving the Midwestern thing, and he did his at Southern and is cranking out high-level publications. That's a pragmatic aspect. If you don't want a teaching job and you're just trying to become a better thinker, the things that we were talking about at the end of the last question, you can write that off. It doesn't matter. I guess more principled, with the proliferation, back to the DMin question, with the proliferation of seminary PhDs, I think that's one of the things that's helped sideline the DMin and make it lower level, is that now you can do doctoral work in the context of people who think like you, and you're trying to analyze a specifically Christian question, and maybe one of our debates, and you can just do that in an academic context. And that has further made the DMin sort of the subordinate contribution, because it is it's not just in the Christian context a doctoral program anymore. Now it is very practically minded and professionally geared rather than academic. Now you have a seminary PhD to do a theological question. That's probably the extent of what I can throw in.
I'll say a bit about my experience, which again I think is sort of unique. So I was at a university divinity school, which is a kind of a happy medium between the two kinds of institutions that you're describing. So it was, my immediate institutional context was quite confessional. I mean, in the sense that it was not, it wasn't uncommon for professors to open lectures or even seminars, grad level seminars with prayers, for instance. You know, and it was there was a very strong esprit de corps, I guess I would say, in the sense that most people in the program were themselves practicing Christians and quite committed to their own faith. And so, you know, I think that, but that was true of my sort of immediate institutional setting. But then, because we're part of the university, you also have access to the full range of academic resources that are available in a university setting. So it's very, just practically speaking, it's very common, for instance, for students both in the PhD and the THD program at Duke to do external minors in, say, classics or in political theory or literature, you know, which is straightforward to do at a place like Duke, because it's just down, you walk down the hall, you know, and find them. So anyway, I enjoyed I didn't do an external minor in another department, but, you know, I took classes in the philosophy department. I took classes in the English department, you know, and that was a really enriching part of my formation. So I mean, obviously there are only so many university divinity schools, but I do like that as a model, a sort of confessional environment within a larger major university.
I think so. Harrison's point is an important one, and that you have to think through employability and also just the different avenues that different places to do a PhD open up. And everywhere that you choose will open some avenues and close others. So it's a case of thinking through which avenues you would like to close and which avenues you would like to open. And it's also the case that there's some places that you can do a PhD that will open far more avenues than they close. So, for example, I think that with a seminary PhD, one thing that it can be tremendously useful for is building trust with that seminary, and you then become very well known to them, and that may well have a positive effect on your chances of getting hired there in the future. But at the same time, then that may have a kind of an opposite effect, in that it might make you much less competitive to get hired elsewhere. But if your goal is very much, you know, and if your path seems very clear that this is the way that you're heading anyway, then it might be the smart move to do your PhD at that seminary. But those things are quite hard to foresee. And the reality is as well that there's a certain class of places that you can do your PhD in, and this is just the way that the world works, that the people from there are, you know, they have all of the avenues open pretty much. You know, I don't think that there are many seminaries in the world where you're going to have people who apply who have, you know, a Cambridge PhD or an Edinburgh PhD or an Oxford PhD, and seminaries are saying, no, we don't want those folks, thank you very much. So, you know, even if you've gone through the one institution track, for example, you're still really up against it in the job search terms. So that's just a significant thing to think through and live by. And I think, so a related issue to this as well, which I think you raised, Jordan, is when thinking about differences between seminary and university PhDs, I think the way that you express and experience and practice academic freedom seems to be different between the two. So I went through a confessionally reformed seminary degree, then Edinburgh University PhD, which is non-confessional as an environment. Then I worked for a confessionally reformed university in the Netherlands, but now teach again back at Edinburgh, which is non-confessional. So I've got a good bit of experience of those two different environments. And I've also examined PhDs at seminaries and at secular research universities as well. And I think if you're working in a confessional environment, particularly for a research degree, there's a kind of pressure on you that's just necessary for the environment that you've chosen to be in, to think through how the things that you argue and the conclusions that you come to relate to things that are really like important commitments to the institution. And if your institution has like its unique selling point, whether that's a particular figure or a particular way of doing theology or whatever, and you decide in the course of your own thinking and your research degree and your PhD that you become quite critical of that's there are all kinds of internal complexities with how you would express that, for example, that you just don't feel at all in a university doing a PhD. So that's quite different. But then in a secular university, there are other kinds of institutional contextual challenges as well, with just different conversation partners that you're engaged with throughout, and the nature of that kind of institution is really different as well. So there's probably not a perfect environment. I'm personally I feel like I really benefited from doing a PhD in a confessionally reformed seminary that gave me a very thorough grounding in what I was doing. But then doing my seminary degree, I should say, and then going from that into a PhD in the kind of environment that I was in, where again, the students that I was working with, some of them were quite, they thought quite like I did, but some of them were so different to how I think about life and theology, and that was great. It was a really enriching experience, and I think it made me a much better advocate and exponent of the kind of theological views that I hold to.
Yeah,
I want to chime in here.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Just very briefly, only because I want to contribute something that I didn't come up with. I heard Kevin Van Hooser talk about this some months ago, and it was really helpful to me. But he made a clear distinction between a vocation and a career as a theologian. And theologically, I think most of us would agree, God calls and equips theologians to instruct and edify the church. And that's something that God does through the body of Christ and for the body of Christ. And that vocation may or may not track along with a career. So God may call you to the task of teaching the church, whether as a pastor or just as a lay member where you're doing serious theological work, maybe leading a Sunday school. But God has equipped you and has called you to teach in some capacity. And if doing a PhD helps one fulfill that role better, then that might be something that you could seriously consider doing. And that may or may not, again, it may or may not track along with a career down the road. It may not be the case that you're doing this full time as a professor. But if God has called you to instruct the church in some capacity, then like this conversation is still very relevant. But yeah, I think just going back to the original point, I think having that clear distinction between a vocation and a career is helpful, especially as some of the other guys have mentioned. There aren't a lot of career openings for people who want to go into Christian higher ed. So it's just a shrinking pool. There's a lot of competition. I don't think anybody in a PhD program should just assume I'm going to get a shot at being a full-time professor. But that doesn't mean that doing a degree is any less relevant. It just means that you may need to be more inventive about how it is that you're going to use that degree to serve the body of Christ.
Yeah. And I'll add one final comment before we move to the next question. I think everything here, I like Brendan's comment about the sort of hybrid environment. I'd love to experience something like that. I think that's pretty cool. I do think there is a sense in which, depending on what institution you're in, it's going to shape the questions you ask. So there's just going to be natural pressures, like James was talking about, that push you in different directions. I mean, in the university context, I mean, I could argue that I could be a crocodile and no one cares, versus, in a confessional context, that might be something that would be like, wow, you're nuts. And then to Harrison's point, I mean, there is a real sense in which the university context, I mean, most of them are going to be more funded opportunities. They're going to admit 3, 4, 5 students. Whereas a seminary, evangelical seminary context is, do you have money? Okay, you're in. Not that crude, but I mean, there is a sense in which it is very much like it's an open door if you can fund yourself. So I apologize if I offended anybody with that comment there. We'll go to the next question. I don't know. We've danced around this one a little bit. What's the difference between the American and UK model of a PhD? I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on it. I mean, my 2 cents is, UK PhD, you don't have coursework. You kind of just jump in and you start day one on your dissertation. You already know your dissertation coming in. I mean, American guys who don't know the UK program, they always ask me like, so have you started your dissertation yet? And I'm like, well, I started that on my first day. So it's just a very different, sense of a program. So Harrison, I know you did both studies across here and there. So if you want to have any comments on that one.
So I think the only comment I really want to make about it is trying to translate the idea to Americans who look at UK PhDs as just shorter. So necessarily more efficient, right? Not necessarily, because the structure of the UK PhDs being right into research presumes the preceding structures of British education. In that when you go to university, you don't have, in Britain, you don't have the core curriculum classes that we take. You're already specializing. And so when people show up at university, in one sense, they're perhaps already aiming at the PhD endpoint, which is not the case for us. So it's not, oh, we don't care if you take classes. It's, we're presuming you come into the PhD with all the skills you need to do it. Whereas the American model is, well, we're going to actually give you, we'll give you the opportunity to learn some research languages in the coursework. We'll give you background and contextual knowledge in the coursework and then set you up for it. Whereas you've got to have that walking into the British model. And secondly, it's not just a strength to be able to do it, because it's a reverse priority. The American system says we will make you generalists and then make you an expert in a specificity. The British model says we'll make you an expert in a specificity and then send you out to become a generalist. I feel the strengths of the. It's not a one is better than the other. I feel the strengths of having gone through the British system in the PhD and coming out sharp understanding of one thing, ready to go learn other things. I also feel my shortcomings when I come up against other guys who have a really thicker knowledge of a generalized set of concepts, outside my specialty. It's a 6-1 dozen the other kind of thing that you just got to weigh up. But that's just to help translate what's going on and the differences to Americans who are watching this, and James can make the case for why the UK system is better.
So those are really helpful comments. Certainly, I would disagree slightly with the way of presenting it as having no coursework. So it might feel like that, particularly if you're doing a UK PhD by distance. But I think for residential students, it's a bit different to that. So, and I can only speak about Edinburgh again, but incoming PhD students do coursework in research methodology at the beginning, so they're in classes there. They are very often in classes for research languages. So when I was a PhD student, I did coursework in French and in German, and I had to teach myself Dutch. But now my PhD students have to do, if they're working on Dutch theology with me, they have to do a year of Dutch language at the beginning, and then we have reading groups after that. A lot of PhD students in the UK system will audit master's level courses, which I think are pretty much the same kind of level as doctoral level courses in US programs anyway. So when I was a PhD student, I audited courses in the Puritans and Karl Barth. I did a bunch of stuff like that. So it's not just, if you want to, you could do almost none of that and pick some kind of very specific project where you would do nothing but research. But for most students, there is actually quite a lot of classroom time, and the thesis doesn't fill every moment of every day for 3 years. Instead, it's part of a bigger acquisition of knowledge. But I think the comment that Harrison made about the different way that you acquire general and specialized knowledge in a flipped way is really astute. So I used to feel like when I was a PhD student in the UK, and I spent a lot of time in Princeton at the Kuiper Center when that was there, and I would hang out with PhD students there. And when they were in the first couple of years, they were just so up to speed together as a conversant group on so many different theologians, but that was from their coursework, and I just felt like this complete specialists who only knew about one thing in their company, and they were talking so broadly all the time. But then I think in the UK system, it prepares you more, as you say, to become a generalist after, because when you land in an academic job, you're not just teaching courses on your PhD thesis. All of a sudden, you're having to dredge up all this knowledge of things that you learned quite a few years before and become more of a generalist through teaching.
So just for guys thinking about this question, you may want to ask your programs about that coursework thing, because I was residential in Belfast, but I wasn't required to do any on the ground coursework. That was available, but I didn't have to do it, and so that could be a question people should ask.
Yeah, so with us, the only thing that's required is the research methodology course. And then beyond that, if you're doing, if you want to do Karl Barth, but you can't read German, you can't do a PhD on Karl Barth. So it's in effect required that you take the German language courses. But as supervisors, we try and work out which classes are on that would be really beneficial for our students, and we strongly encourage them to audit. And so they're in those classes every week and going to seminars.
I have no idea. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, so yeah, one other difference as well that I'm aware of is that so the dissertation length is generally different in the UK to the US. You spend 3 years working on it in the UK, and it's usually 2 years, I think, in most places in the US. I think the US dissertation tends to be a bit slimmer than the UK style dissertation. And in my experience, UK dissertations tend to go on to work as monographs fairly quickly afterwards. Whereas in my experience, a lot of people who do American PhDs don't think of the dissertation as a book in the first place. And it's much more normal that you get your PhD and then you'll spend a few years after that taking what you know, but writing a completely different book to the PhD thesis that you produced. And that doesn't really happen as much in the UK. So certainly I perceive that as a really useful thing in the UK system, that you can have an impact on your field pretty quickly. So I finished my PhD in 2010. And the monograph version of my thesis came out in early 2012 or late 2011, and that all went really smoothly and really quickly. So it came out with G&T Clark, and that was really useful for getting a job afterwards as well. And then your work gets out there very quickly in the field, and then it can start conversations. So there's an agility there that's quite useful.
And just for perspective, given James's point about the dissertation and UK models being a little bit longer, you've thrown out the number of like 100,000 words for UK dissertation. At Southern, for example, the word limit is somewhere between 50,000 words and 80,000 words. So they won't accept anything longer than 80,000, but it can't be shorter than 50,000. So that might be like a dissertation could be half as long.
Helpful context. And James, I'm sure what you said was awesome. I missed some of it. So my 4-year-old was very displeased that his younger brother had taken his little cars, and was playing with them. So I'm out of breath. But Mark Evans sent a cool question that I think covers a lot of the stuff that we wanted to cover in some of the next ones. So I'm going to let him have a question here. Can you speak somewhat to the practical concerns around finances, moving locations, work-life balance, scholarships, granting the concerns on the call? How have you swung it? This covers like 3 or 4 of the questions we wanted to cover all in one. So here we go. I don't know if someone wants to tack on a comment about 1, 2, or all of them in one.
Yeah, I guess I can start us off. This is a great question, and it's very important to consider when you think about doing doctoral work. Especially if you're married, which I was when I went into the program. If you're having kids, our first daughter was born right before I started the program, and the stakes are a lot higher in that. If it's just you, and you want to take some financial risk, in your life, and that's lower stakes than if you're exposing, your spouse and children, to potential ruin or whatever. So, but yeah, I do think given the relatively low rate of return on these kinds of degrees in terms of professional success, in the job market, something that I always counsel people who are thinking about doing a PhD to consider is how well funded the program is. It's not there's no absolute rules about this, I guess, and I think maybe it's somewhat different in the UK in the UK setting, but in the States, it's by and large true that the programs with the best placement rates are programs that can afford to fund their doctoral students reasonably well. So it's still basically poverty wages for the amount of hours you're actually working, but you get a tuition waiver, you get a stipend, you get health insurance, those kinds of things. I think, again, without being dogmatic about what you absolutely ought to do, I do think in general it raises some red flags for me if you're considering going into a PhD program that doesn't provide that kind of support. It doesn't invest, to that degree in students. But I guess the only other thing I'll say about the question of moving is I do think this is definitely a consideration that I really underestimated when I went into the PhD program. That we've only done 2 cross-country moves, since I finished. But I've had to uproot my wife and kids a couple of times, basically just for my job, which is not, obviously a lot of professions where that happens, but there are plenty of professions I could have gone into where I could have gotten a job where we happen to live and where, my wife and kids were already happy living. So that is definitely something to consider. Again, the stakes get higher the more people, more attachments you have.
Are you done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I think, I just want to zone in on or hone in on a particular aspect of moving in relation to the PhD, because a lot of people will do distance, and that is attractive for various reasons that I understand. But if we come back to the vocation aspect, we really have to think about what does it mean to be given this to do it. Now, there are lots of projects you can do from anywhere, but you should really think hard about that. So I'm gonna, James's book on Bobbing is great because he's in the archives. He went and found Bobbing's letters and diaries and used them. So get this book and read it. And find out how to do good intellectual history. If you think a cutting edge historical thesis can be done by Puritan paperbacks, you're mistaken. And the cutting edge of historiography is in the archives now. And so if you're doing something on the Puritans, you've got to be next to you've got to have access to the British Library, Cambridge Libraries, Oxford's Library, the others. I was in Trinity College Dublin once a month for Usher's manuscripts doing mine. And this is really important when it comes to producing something good. So, part of me thinks, especially with how competitive the market is, go do it. And just throw yourself at it. That doesn't mean you can't work and do ministry on the side, but go and throw yourself at the project. And the idea of work-life balance, I think, I actually just want to challenge the premise. I know how we use that phrase, but work is part of life, and God has given it to us, as you'll learn in this book when you read it. So that is within the idea of life, and there are seasons when different aspects of life take up bigger proportions, and it may be advantageous to give your every waking moment that is not God's people and your family as, or, the Lord himself, your family, and then the church, as a ranked list of priorities, it may be to your advantage to throw every other ounce of your energy at your PhD project to get it done, rather than thinking, well, what I really need now is more time with Netflix or whatever. Just thoughts there. So to
Yeah, and Harrison, your point's well taken. So I'm in a distance program myself. I think I'm the only one here who's done that. Everything else for me was residential. The reason that I did that was because of just my context in life. So where I live, my family was situated here. All the fully funded programs, I couldn't work because they didn't offer enough financial stability to pay for my family. So that sort of blocked out some options for me. So I reached out to places like Duke and UNC and said, hey, I've got a regular job. Can you just waive the TA requirement and let me be a student full time and do everything you would normally do, just not be a TA and have those responsibilities? And say no. So that sort of blocked off those opportunities for me. So I looked elsewhere. Now, part of the reason this works for me is because I have an intellectual community here still where I can go use these various libraries and meet with various people. And also my degree is a philosophy degree. So it's not so much designed to, I need to go do the archival work where I have to physically be somewhere to have access to those sources. The people I'm interacting with wrote in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, et cetera. So it's very easy for me to have access to all the material that I need. So for me, it works. But if all things considered, if I had a choice, I would absolutely take a residential program over a modular format or a distance format in any sense. I think there's no question that those are superior.
And Jordan, I'm not trying to knock the distance programs. I'm just trying to and one of the reasons why I have no qualms about how yours will turn out is you are committed to excellence. You're going to do a good job. And so, to throw in the pastoral point again, don't do distance because it's easier. If it works, then fine, but throw yourself at it and work hard and do a good job. I mean, I've read, yours will be good. I'm sure it will. There are other distance PhDs that you can turn into a book. I've read others that, the first chapter, they're arguing about it's a book about a 17th century theologian, and the first chapter he's arguing about which 19th century reprint edition should be used, and I'm thinking, no, 17th century printings. That's and you've missed that because there wasn't somebody there pushing you into the. So just be a Christian about it, right? Do it with all your heart for the Lord to his glory and do a good job, not because you're trying to take the easy way out. If it's distance, fine.
Yeah.
But throw yourself out.
Usually, I think that the distance usually works well for guys who are pastors who want to stay in their pastoral context. And for me, I very much understand that. I'm like, I don't want to take you away from where the Lord has called you to minister, sort of thing. So in those senses, I think the modular sort of formats can be very useful so that we can better equip pastors in their context who would otherwise have no access to that sort of education. Ryan, I know you had a comment.
Yeah, I want to chime in here just because I'm currently trying to navigate this myself and have been for the past several years. So I'm working full time and I'm doing a PhD full time, and I'm married to someone who is finishing her PhD. So we have a lot of things going on between that and trying to be devoted to a local church and just trying to navigate finances and everything else. It's a significant challenge. And I mean, I don't have a lot of deep, well organized thoughts on this topic, but I would say if you're considering doing a PhD, sit down and consider for a long time the consequences, like count the costs of doing a PhD, because there are a lot of potential benefits to doing a PhD, but it's not an easy degree. Even if you have funding, it's long and it requires a lot of dedication. It can be tedious at times. I mean, there have been nights where I've had to work late trying to finish up an assignment and banging my head against the desk because it doesn't seem like I'm making any forward progress. And you just have to continue grinding away at your project day after day for years to be able to make the kind of progress that you need. And when you're working full time, as a lot of people have to do if you're at an evangelical seminary doing a PhD, then you just don't have a lot of time. And so you have to cut corners. Yeah, I'm not saying, well, I shouldn't say you have to, but a lot of people wind up kind of cutting corners just to be able to get by. And that's hard because what can you cut? You know, if you're married, you can't cut your marriage. And if you want to do excellent academic work, then you can't shortcut the the work it takes, the research that it takes to do good work. And so you wind up having to take longer. And then, you know, instead of the degree being 5 years, let's say, as it is for a lot of people, it might be 6, 7, 8, and then it's like a never-ending degree. You're not making much money, so like it's really hard to support your kids if you have them. It's really hard to pay for bills. And so most evangelical students who want to go to an evangelical seminary and do a PhD, it's it's a long commitment and it's quite challenging. So I'm all for people doing academics, and I think that doing a PhD can be great for pastors as well as for professional theologians. But to Brendan's point, if you're considering going into a program and there's no funding and you don't already have funding in place, you know, if you don't have external supporters who are going to help provide for you, then I would like, again, like I said at the beginning, I would consider seriously whether that's something you actually want to do, because it's going to require a lot of sacrifice and it may or may not be worth it.
Good. Another question that Scott asked that I want to give him a chance to have an answer to. If your MDiv does not provide an opportunity for robust independent studies or a final thesis, what would you recommend that student do for preparation for post-grad work?
So I guess I'll take that because it's probably in response to what I said earlier. I mean, I think that there are things that you can do just on your own initiative that would help you prepare. Just lots of reading and reading of primary sources, read the works of scholars whose work you're trying to emulate. But at the same time, if you want to go into a doctoral program and you've done an MDiv that hasn't given you the scope to do a dissertation or some kind of longer independent study, probably that PhD program, at least a UK one, I would imagine, will tell you you need to do an MTH or a THM first, and then just because you need to get the qualification in the first place, you need to demonstrate that you can actually, you know, fare well and the next stepping stone before you would step onto the PhD.
Any other comments? If not, we've got another question here. Let's see, what should we do first? Let's do this one. How important is the research topic one chooses? Must it define one's intellectual trajectory forever or not? Or is there a way to sort of break outside the mold or not?
So the simple answer, I guess, from my perspective is no, it doesn't define your trajectory forever. Doesn't have to. It can. Some people do that. I think a couple of caveats. One, make sure you pick something that will keep you excited for the duration of writing 200-300 pages. You know, that's important. If you lose steam, it'll be miserable for you. Second is a helpful PhD for the wider world and for you should have fallout intellectually, you know, for you and future projects. I guess so. I'm just speaking from experience. I'm not trying to say I'm the example by any means. But I mean, I did my PhD on Ussher's Covenant Theology and published it as a book. And then right now, in the editing process, there's a translation of Ussher's manuscripts that I used that should be published soon. And I wrote on his covenant theology, but then, so now I'm also, hopefully this year or next year sometime, I've got a like a constructive treatment of covenant theology coming out, which is related and it falls out, but it's not Usher and covenant theology still. And falling out of that, I've got another book contract to write about the Donum Stupriatium, which doesn't matter what it is right now. The point is, there was 3 pages about it in the PhD thesis that have now spawned into a book on its own. And so you want something that might have traction to keep giving you stuff to do. I mean, yeah, come back to James as the example again. He's got this. He's sticking with Bavinck. That's great. And maybe he will forever. I don't know. He can tell you, but you see the point. He has stuff that grew out of what he did, and that's a helpful thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. So this is not paid product placement, by the way. I didn't even know Harrison was going to do this, but thanks. I appreciate it. So I think that it doesn't have to define your research trajectory forever. So I think of a friend of mine in the Netherlands, Stefan Paas, he did an Old Testament PhD, and then he's now the J.H. Bavinck Professor of Missiology at the Free University, and has published really significant work in Christian political theology. And he's one of these thinkers who can operate on such a high level in so many different fields that are not, it's not a straight line, I think, from his Old Testament PhD to what he works on now. But I think that people like that who are really polymathic in how they think within theology are probably still the exception rather than the norm. So I think that I did my PhD in historical theology / systematics on Bavinck and consequences of how he thought about the Trinity. But I think that it would be really difficult, having done that, for me to go on to write a book that made any kind of positive impact in Old Testament studies or something like that. That requires such a specialist training that I've just not had. So I can't ever imagine that I would break off in that direction. But my second book grew out of my first, and that was the Bavinck biography. But the book I'm working on at the moment is historical theology, but of a really different topic and in quite a different period, actually. So I don't just want to be the Bavinck guy forever, as much as I love doing Bavinck. But that's always something that I have to fall back on. As I said, it's the well that I always seem to be able to pull up another bucket of really great water to drink from, and will do so really happily for the very long term, I hope.
There's a good question here in the chat that I want to highlight. So Garrett, despite the other comment that you put in here after this, making fun of me, I could put you in timeout. I'm going to give you a chance to ask this. How do you all feel about the adjunctification of theological education? Will an institution resourced by adjunct professors be as effective as a more traditional model? So I think this is really relevant, interesting question here.
I'm against it.
As to efficacy, well, it depends on who the adjuncts are.
Yeah.
And if they're local adjuncts or not.
Right. Yeah, that's my instinct as well, Harrison. I mean, I think that the issue is not so much, very often, the market being what it is, people who are teaching as adjuncts today are often really fine scholars with top-notch training often, there just aren't jobs. There aren't permanent jobs, for all the PhDs that are being produced. So it's a really bad idea, not so much for the kind of formation you give the students who go through those sorts of courses, but it's just not sustainable as a way of constructing an academic environment. You can't make a living long term, with 1 year contracts where you're piecing together your income class by class. And, this is why people do that for a few years and then often drop out of the market altogether. This is another great example of a profoundly pathological race to the bottom in theological education today. And this is true across the academy. It's not in the theological academy exclusively, but
yeah, it's a money issue. I think the guys who are in institutions, can speak more to that. But my impression from the outside is it's cheaper. And I guess one of the things for you to keep in mind for people who are thinking about this is if you end up as an adjunct, probably don't do it just because it's offered. Do it because you think you can contribute. I mean, I've told Edinburgh, you know, especially coming back here. I mean, I'm an adjunct for Edinburgh Seminary. You know, don't me in for the, or I mean, even via Zoom, don't bring me in for the things that anybody can do. But we had a 2-part lecture on covenant theology, and it's like, okay, it makes sense to. I mean, until you find somebody else who's done stuff that I would do that lecture for you. So I guess that's one way to think about it is don't just do it for, you know, because it's the opportunity. Do it because you've got a contribution.
Cool. Another question I want to make sure to include is this one. How can you get the most out of your relationship with your supervisor? And what should you look for as a prospective student in one? James, I'm sure you have some good comments on probably both of these. So I'd be interested in hearing your take.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfect or an ideal supervisor in the first place. And there'll always be some kind of trade-offs you have to make in how you're thinking about a supervisor. So, you know, when you're thinking about a supervisor, for example, you have to think about, especially if you're a student who's looking for a supervisor, you have to think about the match that you have with the supervisor and the supervisor's own interests and expertise. You also have to think about the institution and the kind of base that it is to house the kind of work that you want to do. And the ideal is that you find as an individual and an institution that match up really well with what you want to do. But there are also questions like, do you try and find a supervisor who is a niche specialist in exactly what you do in order to get a lot out of that relationship because they are like your closest possible conversation partners for the kind of stuff that you're interested in? Or do you consider looking for someone who's more of a generalist and who can push your project from a different kind of perspective, for example, who might know the field really well, if not your particular thing that you're working on. So when I was a PhD student, I worked under David Ferguson, who was the chair of divinity at Edinburgh. He's now the Regius chair of divinity at Cambridge. So I was working on Bavinck. David's not a Bavinck scholar, but he's just an outstanding theologian who knows the wider tradition and modern theology and Reformed theology extremely well. So for me, I thought that was a really excellent option to have because I could learn a lot about Bavinck and I learned Dutch, but it was just so helpful to have someone who knew a lot about a lot of things that I didn't know, who was able to guide my project really well within that kind of backdrop. And also he had so much experience. I think another trade-off that you have to think through as well is that the kind of supervisor that you will have will exist at some point in his or her academic career in terms of the experience they have, in terms of how many PhD students they have. So, do you go for a supervisor who doesn't have a lot of PhD students and who might be able to give you a lot more of their time, but then they also might be less experienced? Or do you go for a supervisor who has a lot of PhD students, usually because they're quite a senior person and they might not have as much time to give you, but the time that you get will also, that hopefully there'll be a lot of distilled experience that will benefit you there. So, and again, I was in the latter position, I would say, as a PhD student. My supervisor had a lot of students, but he was so experienced that the supervision meetings with him were just gold. So every comment was really perfectly weighted and tremendously helpful, and it was just great to be part of that. I think as a prospective student, it's really wise to spend some time talking to people about their experiences with particular supervisors, just because it'll give you a much better way of navigating what you think you need and what you're looking for in terms of the various, again, trade-offs that I mentioned before. Ask current or former students what the supervisor's supervision style is like. But also, it's really important to talk to prospective supervisors as well. So when you're applying for programs, if you're a cold caller and the prospective supervisor has never heard from you or heard of you, you're in a much weaker position than someone that they already know because you've been even just emailing or you've had some Zoom chats over the last 6 months or something like that. But I think as well, it's really worthwhile to look around for former students of that supervisor to see, what kind of people did they become? What have they gone on to do? Have they gone on to have an impact on the church or on the academy? Has the PhD created opportunities for them to use their gifts well? Could I see myself in their company in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years?
I'll just talk a little bit about my experience. I've never advised a doctoral student, but my experience of being advised was wonderful, and I don't quite know how to distill that into general principles, that might be widely applicable. But so I worked with a Catholic theologian named Paul Griffiths at Duke, and I fell in with him as a master's student, and he's just, he's one of those people. I think most people think of him as sort of the smartest person they've ever met. Even other faculty at Duke, Stanley Hauerwas will heard him say on a number of occasions that Paul is well, yeah, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that Paul's a kind of legendary figure at Duke in that regard, to a fault maybe, I suppose, in terms of interpersonal interactions. But the thing that I was most looking back on my experience of that relationship, the thing that stands out to me most, which Paul did for me, which I never heard of anyone else doing, was that he would ask me to send him all of my term papers from every class I took at Duke, even classes that I wasn't taking with him, and he consistently gave me better, more demanding, more stringent feedback on papers I wrote for other faculty at Duke than I got, from within the course itself. And there's one episode in particular stands out to me where he sort of called me out on some intellectually lazy moves that I had made in a term paper to sort of throw a bone to the professor who I disagreed with, but he knew that I disagreed, and so anyway, I found that level of investment is unusual, and there's probably no way of predicting, I guess, how you find that, ahead of time. But I do think that, to me, looking back, that was the thing that made the most difference. That it was clear he was really, really committed to my success in every area, not just the things he was required to do.
I want to add just one thing.
Helpful.
As a PhD student, I wouldn't just assume that your supervisor is going to just be on top of reaching out to you. Some supervisors are that way. Some supervisors are very personal. They're very warm. They will go out of their way to reach out to you to make sure that you're doing well. But a lot of supervisors just have a lot of, they're juggling a lot of different projects. They have a lot of responsibilities. They don't have a lot of time, and they can forget about where their students are, what their students are doing. And it doesn't hurt as a student to just send an email out occasionally to your supervisor and ask a question, or say, hey, can I meet with you? And can we catch up about my research or about whatever is going on in life? And sometimes they'll have to say no. Sometimes they don't have time, but I would be proactive as a student. If you want a good relationship with your supervisor, you're gonna have to put in work to get that some of the times, and that's okay.
Helpful. And James, you got one more comment?
Yeah, sure. That's a really helpful point, Ryan. And you should assume the best about your PhD supervisor on two fronts. One, that your supervisor really cares about you, but B, that your supervisor is juggling many balls at the same time and will not be offended at you reaching out. So the point that I wanted to chip in, I guess it ties into Brendan's point. So we've spoken about Jar Jar Binks probably too much, because I don't think we want to make him a role model, because it didn't work out that well for Jar Jar Binks in Star Wars. But to use another Star Wars or illustration analogy, this is something that I've spoken about quite a lot with one or two of my former PhD students, especially Grace Utanto, who's now teaching at RTS in DC. So Gray's model of thinking about this is from Star Wars, which he's never seen, weirdly, but he has a Star Wars idea, which is that as a supervisor, you want to be a Jedi rather than a Sith. The Sith only deal in absolutes. The Sith want you to become exactly like them, and they want to mold you in a very rigid way. Whereas the Jedi don't deal in absolutes, and the Jedi want you to flourish. They want, they want you to be a force for good in the world. And there's a kind of lack of control there as well that the Jedi has, that the Jedi doesn't aspire to, that the Sith wants in training. Something that I really valued about my doctoral supervisor was that he and I are probably quite different theologically on quite a few points, and we're from different denominations and that kind of stuff. But I'd spoken to other people who'd worked under him and who were probably closer to where I am as a theologian, and they all said the same thing, which is he will never belittle you for thinking differently to him. Instead, he will push you to be the most rigorous, the clearest version of yourself, and he will treat that with a lot of respect, and he's really worth engaging with on that front. And for me, that was part of why I wanted to study under him as well. And it's part of what I try to emulate with my students as well, that I don't ever expect them just to agree with me or think like I think, but I really want to be their most sympathetic critic. In private, obviously, when I engage with them in their work. But I think when you're looking for a supervisor, you don't want it to be just a kind of confirmation exercise that you already agree with them and everything, that they already agree with you. It shouldn't be a fragile relationship like that.
Excellent. And I lost Harrison. I know we've got like 3 minutes, so if he comes back, he's going to get to answer this, because we want to make sure, do you need a PhD to be a serious pastor, to publish books, etc.? Because I think we have a lot of pastors who listen. There's Harrison. So I want to make sure you get the chance to answer this question, because I think a good amount of our audience is in the clergy sort of aspect. So do you need a PhD to do that? With the time remaining, we have 3 minutes. Harrison, you tackle it first, and if there's any time, somebody else can comment.
The quick answer is no. And actually, the most serious pastors are the one who are really focused on their task of pastoring God's people and contributing to the church. And if a PhD funnels into that in some way that you can do or will prop you up for that, then that's great. But you shouldn't have your eyes on a PhD as a separate thing. Let it be helping you along. I guess one of the other things is this is actually, you can write and you can publish without a PhD. In some ways it's harder, but just focus on learning to write well, and you can get book contracts. And one of the things I think I want to put in there as a warning is I've seen a couple of guys who were pastors without PhDs and good at producing practical books for the church that are really appreciated. And then they went and did PhDs. And now I sort of think, well, this work isn't what it ought to be. I take their work less seriously now because they have PhDs than when they were writing as pastors without PhDs. I think that they had a lane and they should have been strong in it, and rather than trying to jump into what they probably perceived as the bigger, faster lane. Just play to your strengths, shepherd God's people, do what you're called to do, and if you have other opportunities, well, tackle them as you're able. Don't aim for personal prestige. We're all going to just proclaim Christ and die and be forgotten. And there's something good about that. It's hard to hear, but there's something good about that. And we have to think about using the opportunities we have in light of that.
And I think that's an appropriate note. I think that's an appropriate note to end on. Also, because I have an angry boy. So thanks for everybody who's been tuning in. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've been encouraged by it. And I hope that you can use it as a resource, share it with your friends or something that have questions, and hopefully help you. So thanks for everybody tuning into the only analytic Baptist and confessional podcast on the planet, and now YouTube channel. We thank you guys for tuning in.
Thanks.